So they start wearing women's undies, and then they, start presenting in a more sexualised way, and then they start presenting as a woman, then they start going into women-only spaces, then they start sex offending in women-only spaces, then, they become aggressive in women-only spaces when they can't behave in a sexual way, and that escalates into committing sex crimes against women. So, it was a known paraphilia. It still is. You ask any policeman and he'll tell you the difference between a transsexual and an autogynephile. And the fact that we have known about this and accepted it as a dangerous gateway for decades, and now all of a sudden we're pretending that there's no risk to women, kids and men or anyone else from these sex perverts is ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous.
Welcome to the New Flesh Podcast, the podcast you deserve. My name is Jonathan Astro, and with me is the painfully male, cis, Ricky Allpike, powerful patriarchy. I don't know.
Disgusting.
Just a big, gross guy, really. What do you got to say for yourself, Ricky?
Well, in my defence, I do platform a lot of feminists and TERFs. So does that get me any points at all?
I guess it does. You can't fight biology and what's going on down there. But at the same time, as I've said before, people out there could never know how many feminists and radical feminists as well that you engage with, that you platform. So I guess that you're sort of like the Oscar Schindler of TERFs and feminists, really.
Yes. This watch could have got me one more TERF.
One more TERF. Goodness me. All right. Well, today we've got a magnificent TERF who runs a podcast called TERF Talk Down Under. Her name is Angie Jones.
Aussies represent.
Yes. Yeah, represent.
Angie Jones is a Melbourne-based gender-critical woman who runs the YouTube channel TERF Talk Down Under with Stassja Frei. Angie is a fierce advocate for women and is outspoken about self-ID, biological men in women's spaces, and the right for females and girls to have sex-separated sports categories. Angie, welcome to the New Flesh.
Thank you for having me.
So, Angie, just begin by perhaps telling us some of your journey. You weren't always a podcaster, so how did this all come about?
I have sort of a feminist background. I stumbled into a broom closet underneath some steps while I was at university in 1989, and walked into a room full of women discussing this concept of like radical feminism. And that was at the end of the second wave. And they were, talking about Germaine Greer and all of these names that I'd heard but I didn't know anything about. I thought feminists were these angry man-haters. So meeting this group of women who were talking about how women's bodies are at the root of why they are treated the way that they are was really interesting to me. I was also studying sociology at the time, so I was trying to understand as a young, naive country person how bigger forces shaped the lives of individual people. So those two things together, like the macro of the sociology and the micro of understanding my role as a person born female in a patriarchal world, kind of went together, and I went, how interesting. This makes a lot of sense to me. And I grew up in, an admittedly dysfunctional environment, poor, lower working class in a housing commission estate in regional Victoria. And I had a difficult childhood because my parents were young and they had a disabled son. My younger brother's severely disabled. And so I was always aware of marginalisation and that some people had a worse lot in life because of their either a disability, their social position, their sex and other factors. So, I sort of was a bit more aware than most young people, I guess. And it sparked an interest in feminism. Now, at the time, although I had a brief sort of friendship with someone who's now a trans man, I still wanted the picket fence, because when I was growing up, to have a loving partner and some children was kind of forced on me, and I rebelled against it but only to a point. Subconsciously, that still held some appeal. So, I ended up dropping out of uni because of personal circumstances. I went and I worked up in Brisbane, and I, lived in Melbourne briefly. Dropped in and out of uni, took on a bunch of different jobs, mainly around nightclubs and promoting, venues, a lot of gay venues. And then I found myself behind the picket fence with a bunch of kids. And that's when I really began to understand what feminism was, because I'd had this idealised version of what my life would be like, and the reality didn't match up. The picket fence felt like a cage. So, I'm living this life. I ended off separating from my child's father. I had 4 young children, single mother. 3 of my kids are on the autism spectrum. And right in the middle of it, my father-in-law decides that he's a woman.
That's heavy.
Yeah, well, I'd known trans-identifying people my whole life. My mum's partner's boyfriend had a very unusual, very tall-looking girlfriend. So, I knew what a trans person was. I had shared a house with trans people in Brisbane. I had met drag queens and knew trans-identifying people who were homosexual men who were effeminate and uncomfortable about it. Some were pre-op, some were post-op. I'd been around trans people my whole life. And I looked at my father-in-law and I go, I know this man. He's not transgender. What the hell's going on here? So the impact of that on my family was catastrophic. When he left my mother-in-law, he had been squirreling away money behind her back for gender reassignment surgery. And she'd always known he had a bit of a thing for ladies' undies, but she never expected it to develop into full-blown transvestitism. And so it was a shock, and they separated. Now, my daughter's father was astonished. The only dad he'd ever known, it was a stepfather, but it was the only father he figured he'd ever known, suddenly decides he's a woman. And he's not a bigot either. And he's thinking, nah, this is not right. 12 months after that, Bruce Jenner comes out. And I'm like, oh, hello. How can a man live his entire life as a man with all the privilege that entails, suddenly say, oh, I'm a woman because I've always felt like one, in spite of doing absolutely everything every other man does, including father children, including, male sport, male, manual work, all of those things. And yet they had the arrogance to call themselves women with no concept of what it is to be a woman. And then the kicker was demand that we affirm that delusion. Now, people can call themselves whatever. People can say, they're the King of England. And I might go along with that if I think it's for their benefit. But I'm not going to actually believe that they're the King of England and treat them as such and give them the privileges that would entail. But these men expected women to do that. And many of the men who were claiming womanhood, I noticed, had a history of either family violence, of abandoning children, of narcissistic tendencies in their previous life as a male. And then all of a sudden they're a female and they still have these bombastic sort of demands of people. And it didn't sit right. Nobody was talking about it. Everybody was affirming Bruce Jenner, and nobody was saying, no, that would be ridiculous. The only people I saw calling it out were the Trumpsters and the right-wingers are saying, no, that's a bloke. And I'm thinking, man, I've been a feminist my whole life. I work in women's crisis services, and I'm agreeing with these guys. What the hell is going on here? And that's when I noticed the institutional creep.
Well, just for a bit of, you've answered probably about 8 of my questions, which is very good. So but presumably you would identify as an old-fashioned, I'm assuming, centre-lefty, probably workers' rights, material changes that benefit the marginalised. Is that a fair characterisation?
Yes, it is. My dad was a unionist, and I grew up around his ankles around the campfire. He was the regional representative for the TWU, and they had nudie pictures on their walls. And I remember going in there as a little kid and not looking up. And, so, I grew up around trade unions, and also because my brother was disabled, we had a strong sense of social justice, of fairness, awareness of marginalised people, because we grew up in a housing commission estate. And we were in amongst them. We were the marginalised, and we were very aware of, particularly growing up in a regional environment, how people like us were pretty much ignored, and that politics and things were focused on the city and the people with the money, and people who were on the margins were practically invisible.
When was the first time you heard the word TERF?
I was watching television late at night because I had young children. It was 2014, I think. And a feminist from the University of Sydney called Bronwyn Winter was on a debate that was televised. I think it was on the ABC. And she was talking, because Bruce Jenner had recently come out, she was talking about the argument between radical feminists that men are not women and defending that line, whereas her opponents were claiming that trans women were women and that she was a bigot. And I think that's where I first heard the word TERF. It was also the first time that I heard my views represented by someone on the left who was a feminist. And I thought, my God, I've been out of this for 10 years. I need to find my friends. And I came back into radical feminist circles when this trans stuff really kicked off, mid 2014, 2015.
Yeah, and that term, do you wear that as a badge of honour? Or I know to begin with it was very much a slur, like calling someone a witch, but it seems to have flipped in a way now, because you're seeing people like Posey Parker in the UK who have almost taken that term and turned it into a badge of honour. Do you see it like that?
Well, it's a misinformed slur, because to be a trans exclusionary radical feminist, you have to be a radical feminist. And the people they throw that to are not radical feminists. Like a small handful of us would be. Most radical feminists are against men self-identifying into women-only spaces. That makes us TERFs. But if they're throwing it at Posey Parker, Posey doesn't identify as a feminist, at all. And yet they're saying that she's a TERF. And she's certainly not trans exclusionary, and neither am I, because we both include trans men.
Well, I've got no other way of describing them, but would you break down your opponents for us, if I can use that term? Are the people who throw around the word TERF, or the people who are the people on the other side? Is it trans rights activists mainly?
Well, kind of, but most of the heat that I get are from their allies. They're from men who 10, 15 years ago would have been incels. They would have been right-wing, and they would have been, saying the same things, but from the other side. I get very little interaction from actual trans-identified people. The hostile ones are the autogynephiles, and I have found most trans-identified people who have experienced childhood dysphoria and then went through a long process in adulthood to become transsexual. They are on my side, and I've formed relationships with those people where we can talk about this stuff openly, which has been really helpful. And, most of them are against childhood transition. Most of them are against, men who self-identify into female-only spaces, particularly those that maintain their male anatomy. They're against self-ID because it allows anyone into those spaces, and that makes it harder for those trans-identified people who have had the full surgery, who have integrated into their lives, who live quietly in a female identity, that now can't go places because women like me say, no, all of you get out, because we can't tell the good ones from the bad ones anymore.
So just to pick up on one word you said in there that some of our audience might not be across, what's an autogynephile?
Well, I always say to people, Google it, because, I'm done with doing men's emotional labour. But I consider an autogynephile a man who is sexually aroused by the image of himself as a woman. So it's different from being so uncomfortable in your own body and having, thinking that you would be more comfortable as the opposite sex and actually feeling relief when you take on the characteristics of the opposite sex. That's someone who has dysphoria, gender dysphoria. An autogynephile is a man who's usually watched too much pornography, who identifies with being subordinated, with being degraded, with being, used, and associates that with femininity. Now, you can usually tell the autogynephiles from the transsexuals, because your transsexuals will be down at Woolies in his tracksuit pants, and your autogynephile will be down at Woolies dressed like a lady of the night.
So there's obvious that we're talking about a sexual. There's something arousing about dressing up as a woman.
Well, this was recognised because I when I was at uni the second time, I studied criminology, and transsexualism and dressing up as a woman was recognised as both transsexuals and autogynephiles. And the autogynephiles were quite often people like Buffalo Bill, who went on and escalated into more violent crimes. It's a known paraphilia that is part of a sexual behaviour,
trajectory.
Trajectory. That's the word. That is the word. Yeah. So, sexual behaviour trajectory that meant that that behaviour escalates. So they start wearing women's undies, and then they start presenting in a more sexualized way, and then they start presenting as a woman, then they start going into women-only spaces, then they start sex offending in women-only spaces, then they become aggressive in women-only spaces when they can't behave in a sexual way, and that escalates into committing sex crimes against women. So it was a known paraphilia. It still is. You ask any policeman and he'll tell you the difference between a transsexual and an autogynephile. And the fact that we have known about this and accepted it as a dangerous gateway for decades, and now all of a sudden we're pretending that there's no risk to women, kids and men or anyone else from these sex perverts is ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous.
Well, there seems to be a conflation going on here. You've got these different, I guess, trans camps that trans activists like to all lump together. I can see that trans kids are a separate camp to the autogynephilic men and the people with gender dysphoria, and then you've got this whole other thing happening with the explosion of teen girls coming out as transgender. That seems like a whole other different bag. But is this conflation a tool for kinky men to get into women's spaces, do you think?
Of course it is. And that's why they also they force team the LGB with the rest of the acronym, because, nobody wants to be rude to gay people. Nobody wants to be rude to lesbians and bisexual people. We don't want to be homophobic. So we'll let all the other end, the furries, the autogynephiles, and the heterosexual queers who just have odd kinks, we'll let them in as well. It's their gateway. It's the Trojan horse. It's really a Trojan horse conflating themselves with, the LGB, with the kids, with all of these, family-friendly things and social justice movements that people don't want to be seen to oppose. That's the Trojan horse they use to get in everywhere, including workplaces, women-only services, the public sector.
Well, just while we're on this, in this area, now you've come from, you remember the 90s, you've hung around at gay clubs and a bit of that scene, and I'd imagine you would have been to a Mardi Gras perhaps, so what is this? Just a little tangent. Have you noticed a now that it's what is it, world World Pride.
World
now
Pride, yes.
It's World Pride now, and it's a month. It's Pride Month, so it's getting bigger. But there seems to be this focus not just on, I don't know, like give us more rights, don't fire us just because we're gay or something. It's now we're getting into kinks, you know, old school sexual perversion, like and the rubbing it in people's faces, people with dog masks and chaps and all this sort of stuff, like and sort of it's become a. Have you noticed this creeping in?
Yeah, but I've sort of noticed porn culture more generally because, you know, I'm a woman and I'm a mother, and I've noticed a difference in the behaviour of particularly men towards women in the time that free, unregulated pornography has been available on the internet to boys from the age of about 10. I've really noticed that. And I think this pornification of society is happening because of interests in the most powerful companies in the world, which are big porn is one of them. And nobody talks about it. We all know about big pharmaceutical companies, but nobody talks about big porn. And it is a very influential lobby group.
Well, I wanted to go back to something you mentioned earlier, and that is allies. I feel as though the invasion of biological men into women's spaces has, in part, been enabled by white university-educated liberal women. And I'm fascinated by the motivations of some of these women. I guess some of them could be hyper empathetic or something. This be kind mantra is starting to get a little sinister, though. Do you think that female empathy is partly to blame for the lack of pushback to trans encroachment on women's rights by women?
No, I think it's survival. I think that women defend this because if they know that if they don't, they'll be cast out by men. Now, women traditionally have put up with a lot of dubious behaviour from the men in their lives because to be, rejected or left behind or excluded by men who are usually the more powerful in the dynamic is seen as something to avoid. You know, if you want to get married and have kids one day, for example, you're going to be more accommodating to male expectations of you. If you want to work in a rainbow-friendly workplace and you have to 100% accept a trans-identified male in your workplace to move through your company, you're going to do it. And women are socially conditioned to say yes to men. And even more so now, because, you know, when I was a kid, oh God, I make myself sound old, but when I was a kid, advertising wasn't like it is now. It wasn't everywhere. And the subliminal messages that are sent to women, you must be sexy, you must be fierce, you must be compliant, are stronger now than they ever have been.
Well, let's continue down this track of allies, perhaps. I'm interested in whether TERFs are. Let's start with this first. Do you think that people who share your views, or if we just want to say TERFs or whatever the equivalent is, do you think that you are a minority in the feminist community? And how many women do you think straight up agree with you?
I think the majority of women do not think that rapists belong in female prisons. Male rapists belong in female prisons. I believe the majority of people don't actually believe that 15-year-old girls are having their breast removed here in Melbourne. I think the vast majority of people would fit into the definition of a TERF. I'd probably say even 95%, because the list of what is transphobic gets bigger and bigger and bigger every day. And nearly every person I've spoken to, including some militant trans activists who have a public profile, agree with me on some of those things.
Well, just continuing on one of our, on this question of these allies, I've heard them described, and I thought your answer was very interesting about what the sort of why women might go along with this holus bolus. I've heard them described as handmaidens, in some respect. Now, do you think some of these women coming at it from a different angle are unable to grasp what is going on, in part because of the belief that men and women are essentially the same? Because when we spoke with Helen Joyce, she said that it's possible for a young woman in an urban setting with a laptop class job to not see the differences between men and women until their late 30s. What do you think?
I totally agree with Helen. Like I said earlier, I had this idea in my head of how my life trajectory would go, and reality didn't match it. And you often find that women reject feminism, and they reject even forming close friendships with other women until their kids have grown up or they've been through a bad divorce, or they're no longer considered stereotypically attractive. They've aged out or whatever. And women are sort of cast aside later in life. And that's when they realise the value of their female friendships. They realise the value of sticking with other women, because the men in your life will not stick by you like a woman would. Maybe your partner might, maybe your dad might, maybe your son might. But generally, as you go through your life, your male friends all disappear and your female friends become more important, because you have the shared experiences of having children, of going through an ugly divorce or whatever, of having, multiple, because especially with your careers changing so quickly now, and with women's roles still being lower paid and making it harder to make ends meet and things like that. We have these shared experiences that get so much more obvious as you get older, because your life's trajectories go in different ways, because men stay in the workforce and women either reduce their hours or they leave and come back. And, having children or not having children, your life is still going to be different than it would be for a man. It just is, because you're female. And so I think that women really realise how hard done by by society they are once they're in their late 30s and 40s, once they say left, to go and look after their children, they try and get back into the workforce and their position doesn't exist anymore, and their role has been taken by a 22-year-old that's earning half as much as they would have had initially, and nobody's promoting you at work because you're not the prettiest girl anymore, and all of these other things that when you are young you take for granted, and you think all the opportunities will always be out there for you, and you won't fall for these traps. You hear these old bags going on about these traps that await women down the line. You're going to be in a relationship that's going to last forever. You're never going to separate from your kids' parents. You tell yourself all these lies, and then you get to this other end of your life and it doesn't meet your expectations. And you realise that society, through movies and literature and even what you're taught in school, and just the general stereotypes between men and women that we all grow up with that seep into our brains, you realise that you've been had, and that your sex does determine the way your life pans out.
And what do you think of, and this sort of came out of Helen's discussion as well, and I think it comes at what you're saying from a different way, a little bit more controversial, but what do you think of this idea of perhaps a young woman in that setting that we just talked about, not ever having, not understanding the differences if they've never been hit by a man, if they've never been tackled by a man on a sporting field, like really full pelt tackled by a man, or if they've ever had a child and had to go through, which my wife let me know in great detail was not a good experience. She still says to this day, I wish you'd had the baby. Or just considering that simple thing of the upper body strength of a man, even before we get into, whether you look into whether our brains are different, wired differently or whatever. What do you think of those things?
Yeah, I think the fundamental differences between men and women are undeniable. And, we're conditioned to believe that they are no longer important anymore.
Mm. Well, another aspect would be if you grew up in a working class household, if you saw men around you doing the kind of labour, back-breaking labour that you wouldn't be able to do as a woman. I mean, that's another thing.
When I was 12 years old, I had to give up playing AFL football because I was female, and the boys were rough. But I knew then that they were stronger than me and I could get hurt. I accepted it. Mm.
Well, if we look at local matters now, because you're a Victorian, so am I, and I believe in Victoria, self-ID laws passed fairly silently under the radar, and these were brought in by the current Andrews government. And for our international listeners, this is the government that's responsible for the longest COVID lockdowns in the world. How is it that self-ID legislation was passed with no debate?
Well, we noticed recently it's being debated in Queensland at the moment, but once again, not many people know about it, and that's what Andrews did. There was debate, but it was stifled, it was token, and all of the feedback that they listened to was from trans orgs. It was predetermined before self-ID was passed that it was going to be passed. There was nothing that anyone could do about it. Now, we have not seen the impact of self-ID because we have experienced the longest lockdowns. So it took 2.5 years for the full impact of sex self-ID to be felt to us women in women-only services, spaces and roles. And we're really starting to see it now. We're no longer talking about a small minority of men. We are talking about an ever-increasing amount of men self-identifying as women for a bunch of very dubious reasons and no gatekeeping whatsoever. And anyone who dares suggest that there should be any gatekeeping is cancelled.
Where are the other Australian states at with self-ID laws? You mentioned Queensland there.
I think Western Australia has self-ID. The elections coming up in New South Wales, and if Labor gets in, they have suggested that they will introduce self-ID. I think it's in most Australian states now. Tasmania for sure.
So do you know much about the anti-trans conversion therapy legislation in Victoria?
No, I don't. Because I sort of seem to be the person that people come to with feedback on how these things are impacting on them. So I hear from a lot of psychologists. I also speak to people in my daily life, like, say, GPs or, say, some of my children's specialists, medical specialists, and I ask them questions. I say, this bill, how do you think this impacts on you? For example, I asked my GP what she would do if a young person came in with their mum, say a young teenager, 13 or so, came in with their mum and said, I think I'm transgender. In the past, she would recommend that child to counselling, but since this conversion bill has come in, her employer and I think the Medical Association has recommended that she send the child to a gender clinic, that they don't try and offer a diagnosis, that they don't try and offer counselling, that they don't try and say, well, mate, are there any other comorbid issues, that they go straight to a gender clinic because they're the specialists. But what most people don't realise is the specialists only have the affirmation-only model. So they're not going there to get their condition looked at holistically or to investigate any other outcomes, that child will go to this clinic and say, I think I am trans, and they will be 100% affirmed and potentially sent quickly on a medical pathway.
While we're in this suburb, I'll ask you a similar question to one we put to Catherine Deeves a little while ago. She's got kids, you've got kids, we've all got kids. So what would you do if you if sort of gender contagion or trans contagion swept across your school or one of your kids' friendship groups, and they started coming home saying, all that stuff? What would your recommendations be, or what would you do?
I would introduce them to a transgender person, because that's what saved my kids from going down that path. My kids have always known trans-identified people, including my father-in-law, and they know that some people are mentally ill, in my opinion, sorry, it's true, that some people have a mental health condition, like body dysphoria, where the only thing to relieve it is to change, to take the attributes of the opposite sex, the only thing that makes them feel better. And they realise that it is not, it's a sickness. It's not, I don't mean that judgmentally, but that they realise that, some people may have depression, some people have this sickness where they think that they're the opposite sex. And my children understand that because they've met trans-identified people and they know by looking at them and interacting with them that they are not the opposite sex.
Is this also a way of giving them the reality of what we're talking about here, as opposed to this glitter bomb sort of pornified or ideal, like that guy that person online, Dylan Mulvaney.
Yes.
You know Dylan Mulvaney? This.
Yeah, my kids have seen him.
Well, so I think Dylan Mulvaney presumably is presenting a very different view of the trans experience than I'm sure like someone you would have introduced your kids to, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think, the kids can see through it still, but I think the reason that my children also see through this, and also my eldest daughter who's in her 20s, her best friend is, pansexual, trans, whatever, right? And, this kid's been like this for years and she knows I'm a TERF bigot and I love her to death and we just accept our differences. Now, my kids, I may look gender conforming, but my interests are very non-conforming. I live on acreage and I have a little hobby farm and I'm a woman on my own. I am a vegan who's into Formula One motorsport, and I don't mean that I just like cars. I'm actually really heavily into it. I've always been a bit of a gender non-conforming woman myself. So my children have been grown up without rigid gender stereotypes, knowing that they're male and female, but without the restrictions that people place on children, saying, oh, no, you can't do that because you're a boy. Now, my poor son is one of 4 children and the other 3 are girls. He grew up having to wear the pink jumpsuit. And I remember one day I gave him a pink plate and he had the biggest tantrum ever. And I said, mate, that is only a colour. It doesn't mean it's for girls. And he's screaming, it's for girls. So he got that pink plate every time he got his toast for the next 6 months. And now the same kid will reach for a pink shirt and he still plays footy with his friends. We've never bought into this. Pink is for girls, blue is for boys. Girls, can't play football. Boys can't play with dolls. We have never bought into that rubbish.
I feel like we brought that view in, was there for about 5 seconds where we went, it's okay to have pink if you're a boy, it's okay to play with trucks, blah, blah, blah. But now, if you're a boy and you like pink, that's it. You must be a girl trapped in a boy's body. If you're a girl and you like playing AFL or Formula One, maybe you're a trans man. Like it was there for about 5 seconds and then it's flipped again. How did that happen?
Well, I think in my age group, because we're all tomboys, and I think a lot of us probably did have what would now pass for gender dysphoria. It's like, I can't be a girl because I'm out, I'm a BMX with all the boys, going down into the the storm tunnels underneath the town, doing all those traditional boys things. So we all had this sort of crisis once we turned 12 or 13 and started developing, and the boys started to treat us differently. And we go, hang on, no, I'm one of you. And they go, no, you're not, go away. And that was really, really, really hard time to be rejected from your peers for something that you have absolutely no control over. And for a girl like me who wasn't into girl stuff at all, it was a lonely time and an awkward time. And then comes with that, the sexual objectification that comes with your developing body. And it was a frightening time. It was terrifying because I was one of the boys, but no, I wasn't. And I became acutely aware of that. Now, I think I, myself, and many other women I've spoke to from my generation had the potential to be ticked off as trans if we'd been born now. We would have been down the trans train, we would have had our boobs chopped off, whatever, and, denied the lives that we have had and our children and our, all the other stuff. So,
yeah, well, I think Abigail Schreier talks about it's a way for teen girls to, in a way, escape that biological reality that sort of hits them in high school, and if they are, they do feel awkward with the staring and or the changes in the body, that it sort of pushes them to a trans man sort of identity, I guess.
And look at mainstream pornography. Imagine being a 13-year-old girl and having, porn sent to your phone. It'd be absolutely terrifying. It's violent. Women are demeaned in it. And they think that's what sex is. Now, if that was me at that age, I would want to opt out of being treated like that too.
Yes, Helen talked about that. She said that, I guess it's one of the drivers that a girl would look could easily look at that and say, "I'm out. I don't. If that's what comes with the deal, I don't want that. I'd rather opt out of womanhood entirely."
Yep, that's what I think too.
Keeping it in the political realm for a few more questions, are there currently biological men in women's prisons in Australia?
Yes, they are. There are in Victoria particularly, and we have requested information on how many, but because those men are recorded as female, even if they do not have their birth certificate changed, but because they've been placed in a women's jail, they're recorded as women, we can't get statistics on it.
But why don't people care about prisoners?
They have a perception that female criminals are like male criminals and that they're all in jail for violent crimes or for, being drug dealers or whatever. And while there are a minority of female prisoners who do commit serious crimes, the vast majority of women in jail are there for things like fines. And, the crimes that men commit are far more serious than those committed by females. And so the perception is that all criminals are bad, that they're in jail because they were bad. Someone may have, been an absolute moron and drank too much and drove a car and killed someone in an accident, right? And there'd be people that say they deserve to rot in jail. But do they deserve to rot in jail with a male rapist in their cell? Do they? For one night of absolute horrific stupidity.
Are there any avenues for female inmates to talk about this situation outside of prison? Are there, say, petitions or anything of that in that sort of realm that is trying to shed light on this at all?
Yes, there's a petition going around from Women's Forum Australia. They have a petition to try and get men out of female prisons. We held a protest at Parliament House in Victoria to raise awareness that men are in female jails. And there are activists working to, raise awareness and to speak on behalf of these women who can't speak for themselves. What we're finding is that the information comes out say if a woman is assaulted by a trans-identified male in prison, the information doesn't reach us for 3 or 4 months, usually because it takes someone leaving prison and not risking being retained in there for making a complaint, takes them leaving prison and them telling us then. Therefore, it's old news by the time the media hears about it. Although that's just their excuse, because we know they don't report on it because they really don't want to deal with people complaining that they may portray a trans-identified chosen person in the wrong light.
And is there any ramifications for inmates that come out against biological men in prisons? Does it extend their sentence, or does it affect their parole or anything like that?
Apparently so. I don't know for sure, but yeah, apparently so. That even any sort of complaint about your conditions in there can have you sort of marked as a complainant, and therefore make your daily experience and also your access to privileges or to being heard for parole or something like that. They make those things more difficult. So you're not going to risk getting out, delaying getting out to see your children by making a complaint. You're going to wait till you're out. And by then it's almost too late.
But we're in such a fascinating period with what's gone on in Scotland with Nicola Sturgeon and the UK government going through this issue with this male rapist who rather quickly changed his I don't know what he identified as, and then was getting was held in the female prison. And then we saw these debates between the two parties and the UK government between what to do. And this is just so fascinating because it was like watching the arguments unravel in real time. Like the thread all come apart. That the house of cards come down, because watching Nicola Sturgeon have to say, that this was essentially, I think what you're saying is this wasn't a woman, this was a rapist, a third category of thing. Are you man, woman, or rapist is what I should say from now on. But what do you make of this sort of topsy-turvy moment we're in?
Well, the reason that we are no platformed here and that the media and politicians will not talk about this issue is because as soon as they do, their house of cards will come crumbling down, now tumbling down. Now that is why we are no platformed. These conversations should be held in public. Women should be consulted. We should know that there are men in women's prisons. But this is it. It's not just about rapists in women's prisons. It's about men in community changing rooms, community pool changing room. It's about men at weight loss groups for women. It's about men at breastfeeding groups. It's about men in period or menopause groups on social media. It's not just about the worst men. It's that any man can just say, I'm a woman, even from behind an avatar, and nobody can ask him to leave anymore.
A lot of that sounds like cosplay to me. It's like men trying to get into breastfeeding workshops and menopause. I mean, that just sounds ridiculous to me.
That's the autogynephile, though. He's seeking external validation for himself as a woman. So there's nothing more validating than being allowed into those forbidden places, like those places where no men are welcome, where we talk about our periods or our childbirth and things like that. Now, most men wouldn't want to be in those places, but these men have eroticized womanhood so much that it's the ultimate validation for them, and they seek them out. I've been in a crisis service where a woman has talked about being raped and she didn't realise there was a man in the room because it was advertised as a female-only service. And I was looking at her in the moment that she realised there was a man in the room because he was behind her and he spoke. And I will never forget the look of horror on that woman's face. I will never forget it. And this is one of the reasons that I got my old Twitter account that had 49 followers back in, I think it was the late 2018. And I said, I'm not going to stop talking about this. And it was because of her.
In the UK, they have an organisation called Stonewall, which was originally all about gay and lesbian rights, but have pivoted in recent years to trans activism. This organisation offers programs and training sessions to organisations and institutions about trans inclusivity. You can even earn points in some sort of a scheme by showing how right on you are with all the trans ideology. Now, there's an organisation in Australia called ACON, which was previously known as the AIDS Council of New South Wales. Are they Australia's version of Stonewall? Can you tell us a bit about this organisation?
Yes, they are Australia's version of Stonewall. They go into all major corporations, the public service, and they train people on how to be inclusive. But if you look at the literature, a lot of the things that they are saying, like you don't need female toilets if you have women in your female workplace, that all toilets should be inclusive, aka unisex, is not true. So they're misinforming workplaces in practices that erase women's rights. And nobody is in a position to challenge them because the unions have been captured. The workplaces have adopted these rules because it's also a financially beneficial thing to do. So instead of having 3 men's toilets and 3 women's toilets, now you just have 2 unisex toilets. So it's like a form of economic rationalism, and it's marketed to these businesses as be inclusive and save money, and have a happier workplace. And but they're misinforming these workplaces, and they're misinforming important people like the government and the mainstream media. Now, these agencies know that what they're doing is erasing the rights of women and same-sex attracted people. They know that children are being harmed by these things, but they do it because of these economic benefits. And why they also embrace this ACON stuff, why it's so well supported and so well funded, is because while everyone's focusing on diversity and inclusion and being nice to people with diverse genders, which is the fashion now, is to have a diverse gender, while everybody's focusing on that, they're not noticing that the price of dry cat food has gone up. It's tripled in the last 6 months. They're not noticing the fact that a six-pack of Pink Lady apples costs $8.50 when 4 years ago it cost $3. So they're not, they're distracted from all the important things. The fact that the healthcare system, and particularly the mental health care system, has completely collapsed. They're not looking at that. They're looking at the Pride events and the new Pride Centre, and they're looking at the wonderful feel-good stories that the ABC does on, the man who had always felt like a woman in spite of having 6 kids to 3 different women and, being in the army. It's a distraction, and that's why they embrace it.
Do you think this is a topic we've come at in other podcasts? Do you think this is a kind of a woke capitalism, in a way of distracting people away from workers' rights, material changes, price shifts, things that we should actually be focusing on? Instead, this is a cheap and effective way for these big corporations, these big companies to sort of woke wash those problems away.
Yeah, and I also think it's a way for so-called socialists to become capitalists and to pretend that they're not. I think, that working class people particularly and poor people have been sold out by Labor and the Greens. And I think that these social justice policies hide that. They're pretending to advocate for marginalised people, but who they are actually advocating for are big pharmaceutical companies, big pornography, and the main beneficiaries of that, which are middle-aged, white, middle-class men.
While we still have you, Angie, can you tell us a little bit more about TERF Talk Down Under, how it all started and how it's grown over 70 episodes?
Oh, my goodness. Well, my friend Stassja and I became frustrated that us boring sort of normal women weren't really being represented. Like, if in the rare occasion that a TERF got some media, it was either Kath Deves or Sal Grover, and both of them look like supermodels, right? And they're articulate and well-spoken, and they're wonderful, wonderful, wonderful women. But most of us are just mums and boring and not articulate and not educated, and we feel silenced and invisible, particularly older women. And we thought, stuff it, let's try and do something. And neither of us wanted to do it on our own. And I didn't want to do a YouTube channel on my own. And I have no technical skills at all, which anyone who looks at my channel will realise. And so we just decided to do it together, and we just winged it. We thought that we would be going out to, say, 20 or 30 of our TERF friends. We did it for our friends so that we could all have something to talk about. It's like, or we could put the news out there to each other. We never imagined that influential people would end off watching our channel. Now, it's funny because when Kath Deves ran from the Liberal Party, our YouTube channel clips were all over the mainstream media, and me and Stars, our heads were on there, and nobody ever credited us, because if anyone saw TERF Talk Down Under and went over there and watched the videos, then they'd be platforming TERFs. And the only media outlet who quotes from us is a gay publication that is pro-trans called Outie in Perth, that's over in Perth. And everybody else, including the ABC and most of the mainstream news channels and The Age and whatever, they come over and they milk us for information and never credit us. So, we've been contacted from people all over the world about the issues that we bring up on TERF Talk. And, everyday people just seem so glad to be represented by everyday people. And that's why we did it. I am embarrassed by my lack of technical ability. I am embarrassed by, me making an idiot of myself in a public forum. But, I also hope that I've left enough of a footprint that in the future that my kids can look back and say, my mum really tried to stick up for us. She tried to stick up for kids like us. She tried to stick up for women and for gay people and for truly marginalised people. I really hope that I have left some sort of footprint for people to recognise that.
Well, your show may not be a kind of a slick presentation, but what you do have going for you is authenticity, which I think just comes across straight away as soon as you listen to the show. And I quite like how you do. It's almost like a daily update of what's in sort of the news of the day in relation to the whole trans issue, which I think is really good.
So Angie, while we've got you, I have to ask about this. While I was stalking you online, I came across a very odd website. What is the TERF Supper?
Oh,
have you heard of this? The TERF Supper.
Some friends of mine and we went to an event at Melbourne University, which was talking about ACON's capture of the ABC, basically. ACON's capture of, universities as well. And afterwards we went to the pub. And while we'd ordered and we were waiting for our dinner, there was probably 15 or so of us. While we were waiting for our dinner to be served, 3 or 4 masked trans activists burst into the pub and started throwing things at us. We didn't know what they were, and started taking photos and filming us. And of course, we all freaked out, going, "What the hell is this?" And we knew immediately it was trans rights activists, but they were very intimidating, covered in masks and sunglasses and stuff. And a few of our women jumped up, older women, and sent them scurrying off. Right? They weren't expecting us to retaliate, but when you come and you seemingly throw something at a table full of women, they're going to stop you. Anyway, these clowns scurried off, and there were some notable people at that function that really didn't want the bad press about being there. Excuse me. And so, it was really awkward. We thought, oh, look, we made fools of them. We sent them off and we won't see it ever again. And, a few months later, this TERF Supper website pops up. And these people had taken tiny little pictures of, they've taken a photo of everyone at the table, and then they've cut out all the pictures of each individual person. And the people that they could identify, they've written a little bio of their sins and, who they are. And I think they called me a prominent TERF, which I was very flattered by. And, said all these horrible things about what a transphobe I am. And, of course,
there was a seating chart as well.
Like,
it's presumably they were trying to be true to where you were seated at the table.
Yes.
They were trying. But the funny thing is, the lady that was to the right of me, they said that she was Linda Gale. But she really isn't Linda Gale, unless Linda Gale is also transracial and can also teleport, because Linda Gale wasn't even there. And then they said the woman on the other side of me was Rachel Wong. And Rachel Wong lives in Sydney. And the woman next to me looked nothing like Rachel Wong. So these people got it wrong in so many different levels.
So it was racism as well.
It was racism. It was, all sorts of stuff. But, but they identified myself and a couple of other women and wrote really horrible things about us. We didn't care. We thought, oh, yeah, that'll go away. Then, unfortunately, The Age decided to write an article about the event that mentioned the TERF Supper website, which incited...
It's such a stupid word, the TERF Supper website.
For those who don't know, this website, for me, when I first saw it, it made me think of the old school stalker in a Hollywood movie that has the pictures all up on the wall in the basement and, just...
In the line of fire.
Yes, that sort of deal.
You've got all your pictures on the wall,
That's what it felt like to me.
Yeah, well, because The Age published its name, people looked it up, and it brought all these trans rights activists to my Twitter And so basically the Age incited these trans rights activists to come and abuse the people identified on the website. And I complained about that directly to the journalist on Twitter. And I thought that was really irresponsible of them, knowing that we had been subject to violence from these people bursting into the pub like that. And it was only a week after that one of the women in our social group in Melbourne was pushed over by a trans rights activist and had her shoulder broken. So, in a climate of escalating violence against women who they identify as TERFs, the Age very irresponsibly brought attention to a website doxing and posting false claims about women. So I was pretty unimpressed.
Well, just a couple of questions left, Angie. I'd like to know, are there any events coming up that we need to know about?
Yes. Kelly J. Keane is coming to Melbourne, and I suspect quite a few people will be attending. And I know that some trans rights activists are also attending, but I have been assured by the police that they will be kept quite well away. So I think the time has come, particularly now that everyday people are being impacted by self-ID and they are being impacted in their workplaces and in their private spaces by these men demanding access to our spaces, that it is time for everyday people to come to this event and stand up and say, men aren't women. We're not going to tolerate being gaslit anymore. And they can come and they can listen to women talk about the impact of this ideology in real time. Because what Kelly J. does, she's very charismatic, and she invites women to come and speak and tell their story in 3 to 5 minutes. And what you find is women just speak off the cup, and that you hear their true story. You hear how this ideology has impacted them. Maybe their child is trans. Maybe their husband left them to become a trans woman. Maybe there's a trans person in their workplace. Maybe they just identify with, the whole thing of feeling like they're trapped in the wrong body, but they just, stayed in their own body and became, a comfortable butch lesbian, So people are telling their stories. These are the stories the media don't want you to hear. And Kelly J has this wonderful way of making women feel at ease enough to tell those stories. Now, this event in Melbourne is on the 18th of March, and it's at Parliament at midday. And we would like people to come and listen to women.
And will this be on the steps at Parliament or in Parliament itself?
It will be on the steps of Parliament, yes. And we are hoping to get an audience with politicians. That's why it's at Parliament, even though it's on a weekend, because we know what politicians are like. They're not going to come to you. You've got to go to them. So we have requested an audience with all of the Victorian MPs, and we expect that most of them will ignore them. But, I'm a left-wing woman asking for, Labor and Greens politicians to come and listen to me and how self-ID has impacted me personally and professionally, because nobody's listening. Nobody's listening to women who have been directly impacted. We don't have a voice, and this is a chance for us to speak up.
Well, I know a lot of women, including my wife, who listens to this program, who are in the closet, so to speak. Okay, they pretty much share your views, and they're terrified. Okay, do you, this is coming from you, not me. Do you think that it's time for these women to come out and get it done?
Yeah. Look, I've always been out on this issue. I get very little pushback. I'm fortunate that I'm self-employed, and that I also have another job, and my boss just, she can't comprehend any of this, but she just thinks it's obscene that anyone would think a man was a woman in all circumstances. So, I'm relatively safe, but, I have children, and when people come and give me crap on Twitter, they don't hang around long because, facts are like kryptonite to these people. So, it's not that difficult to just deflect away, any people that come to attack you, because people build it up in their head what it's going to be like when people find out that I'm a transphobe or whatever. And it's nothing like that most of the time. Most people say, I wish I'd come out sooner, and also, you don't have to come on the event and, wear a T-shirt with your name on it. You can come and you can wear glasses and a hat, and people are going to be too busy screaming at Kelly J and the other notable TERFs to notice that you're anonymously coming along to an event with, a couple of hundred other women. They're not going to notice you, so... just come
unless
along.
it's the TERF supper too. It's the TERF banquet. They'll get another video with more little photos. And there they all are.
Yeah, I've got a T-shirt that says Team TERF, but I'm not going to wear it because it'll be inflammatory. So,
I love those hats that I think I've seen Brendan O'Neill from Spiked wear, and I think it's like a MAGA hat, the red hat, and it says "Make women female again."
I haven't seen those. That sounds great. But I think, it's time for people to speak up because, people are being deeply affected by this. It's not an abstract thing.
Are you going to go, Ricky?
Yes, I think I'll have to go. Yeah.
I'm putting him on the hook.
Yep.
On air.
You've heard it here. I'll be there. I'll be in attendance.
Thank you. Thanks for coming along. It'd be good. It would be interesting. Like, Kelly J, it's strange. It's sad, actually, that it's taken someone from outside coming in to give women in Melbourne a voice. I think that's really sad because without her, we wouldn't have one. We do have our little protests and things, but people are so afraid. And, of course, with Kelly J's profile, that somewhat protects us from the trans rights activists because if they attack Kelly J, it's going to be seen. Whereas if we're down at Parliament with our pickets, then and we get attacked, nobody's going to care and they're going to say that we asked for it. So, this is a really good opportunity if you haven't been to a protest before, particularly if you haven't been to a women's event before, because it's not a protest. It's actually a celebration of women. The air is quite electric because when you get a group of women in a space where there's not a lot of men or there's no men, it's a really different energy. And it's quite invigorating. So, I urge women particularly to come down and be a part of that and for men to come down and observe it. It'll be a wonderful experience. I think it'll be fantastic.
Well, by means of wrapping up, Angie, how can people find you and your work online?
I'm on Twitter, Angie Jones, ANGI Jones. And TERF Talk Down Under is on YouTube. Make sure you do the Down Under because Kelly J. Keane stole our name and she's done TERF Talk Tuesday and we're TERF Talk Down Under. But what we found is their algorithms help us. And if you can, like, subscribe and share, that'd be fantastic. And, we there's some really amazing women doing some amazing work out there, but we don't really have a platform for them. So, Coalition of Biological Reality platforms a lot of the work that women do, but it's mostly invisible. We send in work into all the media outlets and nobody will share it. Nobody will allow us to write for them. They say, yeah, this is great, but, our editor won't allow it, So, just look them up. And, that my role, I think, essentially is to platform other people. It's strange for me being here, being the subject of an interview when I see my role as a facilitator of women who have a lesser platform than me to give them a voice. That has always been my role. And that's what motivates me to keep doing what I'm doing, even when I'm absolutely mortified and embarrassed at how amateur I am. So,
well, before we let you go, Angie, we have a final question that we ask all our guests, and that is, what are you reading right now?
What am I reading? Oh, it's boring. It's a TERF book.
Well, come on.
I'm reading Sex Matters, and it's about how our biology impacts on the way we receive medical treatment, and it's really interesting.
Author?
I can't remember. She's in my lounge room. Previous to that, I was reading a book about the thylacine, and I would have much rather say, I was reading a book about the thylacine because it sounds like I'm, a more interesting person, I guess, and also a bit of a conspiracy theorist. But if you're reading,
let's put it this way: if you're reading, you are ahead of most people.
That's true.
That's okay.
Oh no.
Yes.
I get to prove my legitimacy as a TERF. When someone releases a book, I feel that I have to buy it because people say, "Have you got this book?" And I say, "Yeah," and I see myself broke buying books, and I've got this massive TERF pile of books that I'm meant to be reading. But when I have to look at this stuff day in, day out, when I read, I'd rather some escapism. And, when I was reading about travelling through the mountains in Tasmania looking for a thylacine, that's where I wish that I was. So, I do have a life outside Twitter, surprise, surprise. I really do. I don't spend all my time online being a bigot.
Well, that's right. Well, you need more than one person has said in their answer that they read Jack Reacher, or something like that, because Ricky and I spend an inordinate amount of time talking about transsexual, sexual perversion, peeping toms, the whole schmear. So I appreciate a bit of escapism for sure.
And I've been reading Cormoran and Strike too, so JK gets the royalties. So, yeah, the Strike novel's very good escapism too, yeah.
Well, Angie, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure, and we'll have to check in with you sometime in the future and see how it's all going.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the New Flesh podcast. If you like our work, please consider rating us on Apple Podcasts or even writing us a review. It really does help the show reach a wider audience. We'll be back with another episode next week. Until then, long live the New Flesh.